Everybody, during the queue here with this edition of the SJIQ, formerly known as the San Juan IQ, but we kind of do both. We've got a fabulous guest this week. I'm privileged to have Arjun Murti with Veriton on, and he has a weekly podcast and puts out great information on what's going on in the world energy picture. So welcome, Arjun, to tell us a little bit about yourself and how is it going? How's it been?
Jerry, thank you so much for having me. And I love that the name was San Juan IQ. My career actually started in the early 90s, just a few years after Burlington Resources at the time, and some others were ramping up San Juan coal bed methane, coal seam gas production. And so I caught some of that wave. But it was the first 20 years of my career, I was an equity research analyst, started at Petrie Parkman in Denver. Most of my career was at Goldman Sachs, spent a little bit of time at JP Morgan on the buy side. And then for the last 10 years, I've been doing mostly board and advisory work in and around the sector. I am on the board of ConocoPhillips, a senior advisor to Warburg Pincus, and an advisor to the energy group at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. But I've recently unretired to join my old friend and someone I know you know, Maynard Holt at Veriton. And we are an energy research and strategy firm. As you noted, I write a weekly Substack blog called Super Spiked. It is for free, accessible to anyone, arjunmurti.substack.com. And it's mostly written posts and the occasional YouTube video that is also published on the same platform. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. And I've been listening to and reading what you put out there. It's really some good information. It's kind of a culmination of what you hear out there with a lot of things, but it's also your unique perspective from the investment community, and I like your thesis on the lucky billion of us who have affordable, plentiful, mostly reliable energy, at least that's up until now, and talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go from there.
As you mentioned, Jerry, my career is as a Wall Street equity analyst, and as an analyst, you're only just trying to make the right call. And what I found is, especially with some of the policy work I'm doing, and then to see like the ESG movement that's cropped up here, and a lot of what's become a very divisive debate about energy. We have to decarbonize on some incredibly fast time frame, and if we don't do it, it's going to be a big problem. And I just take a step back and say, why do we use energy? It is the reason for everything. It is all economic growth. It is all of our human prosperity that we've enjoyed over the last 150 years comes from using energy. Nothing happens without it. But what I really find striking is that there really only is about 1 billion of us, US, Western Europe, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, probably need to throw South Korea in there now, that use a disproportionate amount of the world's energy. And you got the other 7 billion people on Earth that are using a fraction of what the lucky 1 billion of us do. And so it is imperative that we deal with environmental challenges, clean air, clean water, biodiversity. I do support the idea that lower carbon, all else equal, is better than higher carbon. I do agree that there are geopolitical challenges to being too dependent on the Middle East and Russia, but it all starts with needing energy. And that is what, to me, we have to solve for. We will not make any progress on any other goal if the other 7 billion people on Earth do not gain the kind of access that they're absolutely entitled to, and that they will gain. They may not gain it in the next 10 years, they may not gain it in the next 20 years, but we do know through the combination of development of available, affordable energy with, frankly, capitalism or some version of capitalism, as a country, you can become rich. You can move up that economic ladder. And it is solving for those energy needs that is really kind of a motivating driver of why I write publicly again.
Well, you've done a great job of articulating that. You've done well. What would you say on average is the average barrel per year per person in the for the billion of us, the lucky billion, and what is the average per barrel per year for the people that are trying to improve their lives?
And so this really frames the discussion. So if I just use oil demand as one variable that allows us to speak in tangible numbers that I think most people understand, world oil markets are 100 million barrels a day in very round numbers. The 1 billion of us, we're using about 41 million barrels a day of that 100. That's 13 barrels per person per year. And in the US and Canada and South Korea, it's about 20 barrels per capita. Europe's actually down to 10 to 11 barrels per capita. And the ranges vary a little bit, but we average 13. The other 7 billion people on Earth are using just 3 barrels per capita. It's 59 million barrels a day in current demand. And frankly, there are pockets of 1.4 billion people. I call it the 1.4 billion people club. India using just over a barrel per capita. Africa barely over 1 barrel per capita. China has gone from 1.5 barrels per capita to 3.5 over this economic miracle they've had over the last 20 years. But even that 3.5 is half the rate that Thailand's using. And no one thinks about Thailand as being sort of more dominant as an economy than China. And the point is, you've got these huge swaths of humanity that are just using so much less energy than the rest of us, but who aspire to the kind of economic growth and standards we have. If you were to say that the whole world someday will just be similarly wealthy, we can call that a utopia, we can call it whatever we want. And let's just say we do have electrification and some of these trends in the US and Europe that takes the 13 down to 10. If you move everyone else up to 10, the 100 million barrel a day oil market would actually be a 260 million barrel a day oil market. Now that's a preposterous number. I actually don't publish it. I didn't say what year it is. It could be 100 years from now because they're challenged governments in some of these places. There's going to be wars and all sorts of issues along the way. There'll be recessions and so forth. I don't think, and I don't know, but I don't think we should expect to have a 260 million barrels a day of oil demand. And that is, to me, why you need new energies. So I reject the idea that this is a zero-sum game and you somehow have to pick between, quote, fossil fuels and the new stuff. We're going to need all of it. And I will say, Jerry, the new stuff better work. It has to work because it's not okay that people are left behind. It is not okay that some portion of that other 7, soon to be 9 billion people, that they get left behind. And so hopefully things will ramp, but we're going to need everything. And we're going to need a whole bunch of everything for as long as I can see.
Well, the United States seems to be taking the position that it's better to look for oil from Venezuela and from some of these other countries, whereas the local, or at least the rhetoric, from the national administration, the rhetoric is that American oil needs to be pushed down, and we actually see that in our San Juan Basin on the federal leases and what's going on there in the permit slowing and the lawsuits, the NGL lawsuits. So
the rhetoric is the problem, and it is in some respects we've had miraculous growth in both crude oil in this country through shale oil development and frankly LNG exports. So on the one hand, mercifully, a bunch of this oil and natural gas and LNG stuff is in Texas, which does allow this stuff to get developed without too much of a overhang from the federal government. But the rhetoric can be relevant. And you mentioned the San Juan. This is true of Appalachia. It's true of oil trying to come down through Canada. You have seen the federal government get, or local groups, environmentalists or otherwise, get in the way of the development of our resources. And this is one of these points where I think there's an idea amongst those people that are particularly oriented about climate, that the only reason we use fossil fuels is because evil big oil companies are jamming it down people's throats. And I find that to be an insane argument. The world needs energy. No one cares where it comes from. No one actually cares the source. Most people could care less whether it's crude oil, natural gas, nuclear. No one even really understands the differences. All you care is that you can drive your car, turn on the lights in your house. And again, in the United States, we're very lucky we can take all that for granted. That is not true in large parts of Africa, India, and other parts of Southeast Asia, and so forth. But we've got this situation where activists have now made this a divisive issue. Now, and frankly, the far right does this as well. We should not be against new technologies. There's a lot of good reasons why we should try and limit our domestic demand so we can export more of our crude oil and natural gas to the rest of the world. That'll make us a stronger country. Are we able to increase our multiplier of GDP relative to our oil demand uses? So I would really strongly encourage everyone, as best as one can, to take the divisiveness out of this debate. What I will say very strongly, though, is the world is a better and safer place when you have strong US and Canadian oil and gas companies, because the rest of the world benefits from our oil and gas. We don't need the very tragic situation in Israel and the impending conflicts between Israel and Gaza, and we'll see if it extends out. We don't need that as a reminder to know you don't want to just be dependent on the Middle East or Russia or some of these other nations that are hostile to our interests. And this is where I do not understand how anyone could be rhetorically against U.S. oil and gas. And I usually throw Canada into that mix as well.
Right, right. So on the a couple of weeks ago, you talked about you thought we were in a super vol set of circumstances right now, and we could be going into a super cycle. So that plays into what you just talked about in the narrative of reliable energy that pushes it up against cheap and affordable, or affordable and reliable, because what that does is it causes, there's constraints, there's these world constraints. So how do we on the public perception, so much of what I think happens is these super cycles come along with oil and natural gas, and now we're the bad guys. We're the bad guys we're raising the prices. How do we get the narrative out there that I mean, we put ourselves in these positions, and all the constraints and things we have going on. So
I think there's a lot in that question that is worthy of unpacking. And so, again, one of my motivations for writing publicly again is this idea that we're in a messy energy transition, because I think we've got the worst of all worlds from a policy perspective. There's this idea that we can solve our energy and climate challenges by simply limiting production of fossil fuels. But by the way, for some reason, only in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, these are the companies that are under pressure from their own country governments, which is an insane concept if you really spend 5 seconds thinking about it, and that somehow is going to lead to motivation to develop new technologies and so forth. And I think the exact opposite is happening. All we're doing is giving strength to other parts of the world that do still have a free rein to produce oil and gas. Yes, our oil supply is growing. Yes, our LNG exports are growing, but we could be doing a lot more to promote even stronger domestic, and I'm going to, again, throw Canada in there, oil supply and demand. Now, my career was one of the big calls I made at Goldman. We called it the super spike call in the 2000s when oil was going from 20. We made the call it was going to ultimately get to 100. That was driven by China growth, BRICS economic expansion, and the idea that we'd kind of run out of the easy oil, quote unquote, that was developed in the 1970s boom. These cycles are very long-term in nature. And I think we're sort of getting to that point again where still very optimistic on shale, but the kind of very robust shale growth rates, I think, are going to start slowing. And U.S. shale oil has been 90% of global oil supply growth. Global oil supply growth has come from shale over the last decade, and that is showing signs of slowing. The only reason I view super volatility as our framework for commodity prices, meaning you're going to have big spikes, but similarly big collapses, rather than the super cycle language that I used 20 years ago, is because we do have economic uncertainty in the United States and Europe, but especially in China. And these are the 3 largest oil consuming regions. So if these 3 areas are either on the cusp of recession or otherwise not having robust economic growth, I don't think the supply crunch has yet come to bite. But I do think we're headed in that direction. You can't have still trough levels, bottom of cycle levels of capital spending, and think oil and gas is just going to bubble out of the ground. That is not. You can't have restrictions being placed on oil sands growth, on Alaska, on a whole bunch of different areas, and then somehow think, well, let's just lift sanctions on Venezuela and let's, turn a blind eye to the sanctions we do have in place on Iran and think that that's somehow going to lead to a healthier world. We don't need new geopolitical turmoil to know that that is not the answer. Yet that's the role we find ourselves in. I think it's just a question of time. I just don't know whether it's 1 more year or 3 more years before this super volatility regime does shift to the next super cycle. And just a final point, Jerry, in past super cycles in the 70s, oil went from 3 to 30 up 10x. In the 2000s, it went from 20 to 100 up 5x. I'm not a Goldman anymore, so we don't make these sort of public oil price calls. But if our starting point is 50 to 60, where within 5 and 10x type increases could we be looking at those types of increases? All I'd say is that is what's happened in past super cycles. We'll see what happens this go round.
Well, and the time I was in growing up, the Arab oil embargo happened. I was a teenager. Price jumped from 3 to 12. During college, the Iranian hostages were taken. We saw a huge jump there. The birth of the spot market. I'd never heard of the spot market, and I did some studies in college for my economic projects on that. And anyway, so I've grown up with it even as a youth, but now you see it as a career person in the business. With U.S. companies not spending on E&P, with the merger mania which is going on, these super majors are going to be controlling a lot of that Permian. Where does that leave other small companies, the small mid caps, and even the little guys? Are they ripe for takeover? Is this consolidation time?
I mean, it's a really tricky time for the sector, because I would say that even if someone isn't a climate ideologue that believes oil and gas demand is going to fall by some large percentage in some crazily short period of time, like by 2050 or something like that, even if you're not in that camp and you're just a generalist portfolio manager and investor, there are two things that continue to weigh on you. One is, last decade was a tough decade. These cycles are long-term. We're just coming off what was a pretty tough, poor profitability decade last decade. And even though profits have been better now for 1 or 2 years here, it hasn't been quite long enough to convince investors, hey, better times are here to stay. And part of the reason for that, part of the reason why investors have been questioning things, is there is uncertainty on the outlook for demand. Now, maybe it's because of recession, which is a normal thing, or maybe it's because a general investor doesn't know. Maybe EVs are going to take over oil demand or what have you. I don't think they will, but I guess it's not been a long enough period where some of these fears of demand displacement have gone away. And you're starting to see a lot of growing pains, maybe the kindest word, in some of these new energies areas. Some of it's just the normal excessive optimism we had now being replaced with some realism. Some of it's the rise in interest rates. Some of it's just, hey, these business models don't scale without massive government subsidies. And so you're seeing a real shakeout in some of the new energy spaces. I think the dust will settle. Some of the businesses will be okay. Many won't. And that's kind of a normal thing. But that could be an example of the thing that starts giving investors confidence. You know what? Oil and gas demand is actually going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future. And even though China's having issues economically, their oil demand is actually still up by a decent amount. And their natural gas demand is likely to grow. And this is going to be true for India and other parts of Southeast Asia, and maybe someday Africa. And so I think there is probably people just starting to gain confidence in the demand outlook, but you need both. You need to believe profitability is going to be better and oil demand is not going to fall off a cliff to want to invest in the sector. So before that happens, we're starting to see some of the bigger companies say, hey, let's try and buy some of these assets cheap. They may not be cheap like they were in 2020, but listen, even though spot oil, as you mentioned, has done very well, long-dated oil has barely budged. The long end of the curve is still, $65, $70 a barrel. So if I can buy XYZ oil company, Permian player, Guyana player, whoever it is, using a long-term oil price of 60, 65, maybe that will look good 3 to 5 to 10 years from now. And more importantly, these are great low-cost resources that are going to be part of my portfolio for 30 or 50 years down the road. So even if the outlook is bearish, I think I'd want Guyana barrels. I think I'd want Permian Midland barrels as an example as part of my mix. And I think the question then for other small companies is who has that sort of sizable low-cost running room of inventory. And I think there's some that do, but there's probably a lot that don't. And that could be one of the challenges out there facing smaller companies.
Right. Well, and I mean, most experts realize that the EIA oil peak demand forecast is a lot of nonsense. But there's people in the United States and Europe and developed world that they buy that hook, line, and sinker, and they're using that to just continue to pound we've got to convert EVs, we've got to do this right now, right today. Comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, it's the IEA, the International Energy Agency, that has gone from being sort of created to help promote truth in energy matters of all things, and to ensure we don't have the type of disruptive situation like we did with the Arab oil embargoes and the Iranian revolution of the 70s. And they've kind of turned into an activist organization in favor of an ideology of we need to transition as fast as possible, no matter how logical or illogical it is. Again, I remain supportive of pursuing new technologies for the sole reason that when, we need to figure out ways to provide energy for the other 7 billion people on Earth. And I do think a lot of those countries, like look at China as an example, they have made a lot of progress shifting to electric vehicles. Why is that? Is it for climate reasons? Well, we all know they've been a rapid grower of coal-fired power generation. They are now half of the world's coal production. Coal supply, by the way, coal demand is making an all-time high. It has never, ever before been higher than it is right now. And so that continues to grow. And to me, it's a sign that China would prefer a coal-fired electric vehicle over an OPEC plus or even shale-fired internal combustion engine. Like you don't as a country want to be importing 12 million barrels a day of oil from either Saudi or Russia, or for that matter, the United States or Canada, if you're China in this case. And I think if you look at India, if you look at some other countries, they're going to see that as well and say, well, we don't want to someday import 15 million barrels a day or whatever the number would be to get them developed. So I think, again, there will be motivation to do these new technologies. But to me, the numbers are overwhelming. I think these IEA net zero reports, people are going to look back and say, this is some of the worst research, the most damaging research ever published. And the reason it's damaging is it's motivated people to say, I don't need to invest in energy. That is not okay. That is not the purpose of the IEA. I fully support new technologies, but you ought to fully support the stuff that we actually use today. 80% of our mix, as you well know, Jerry, is oil, natural gas, and coal on a global basis. The world cannot live without it. But of course, the 3 billion people who are forced to live without it because they do not have adequate energy. And it is something that I feel very passionately about. I do think these IE net zero reports are really amongst the most damaging reports that have been published.
When I think that the world looks at OPEC and Saudi Arabia bouncing back a day later and saying that, and they go, well, they're just saying that because they produce the most oil in the world. And, I mean, how can you do that? But I mean, I understand how the new energy world needs encouragement. And I think they've got as much propaganda and as much support and subsidies as, oh my gosh. I mean, they say that our industry is subsidized. Holy cow, we get IDC and depletion, maybe, but
well, I think the market's starting to wake up to that point. And so, at the end of the day, why are we trying to transition our energy systems? We're a country of whatever, 375 million people. We are a very wealthy economy, but we haven't established energy infrastructure. We should try and, make it cleaner if possible. But the idea of we need to replace it is simply preposterous. What the world does need to do is figure out how they can provide energy for everyone else on Earth. And that should be a mixture of both traditional energy, because that's what works. That's what can ramp up. But as best as possible, try to do some of the newer stuff there. Again, if you're India and you have a whole bunch of coal, you're surely going to try and develop it. I suspect they will also try and do solar rather than import LNG, because they're not going to want to be dependent on Qatar or US or whomever. If a future US president randomly decides to ban exports, that could be a Republican, by the way, it might be a Democrat, but someone may do it. I think that may be bipartisan. And you're India and you're suddenly dependent on LNG imports. Well, I think that's why they're going to do solar with their coal. And maybe they'll do nuclear. And again, so it is really about trying to solve for the energy needs of the rest of the world. And it's going to be all these technologies. And nuclear is for sure got to be part of the mix if we want reliable power that is also has a low environmental impact, all things considered.
Yeah, you see a lot of folks talking about nuclear and the zero emissions and all that, but getting over the regs is the tough one. So finally, we're an independent company.
Yeah,
we've got small staff. We don't have a whole bunch of folks in cubicles that are doing our projects for it. We're all doing it ourselves. Independents, privates have taken on riskier projects these days. Yours truly here has a couple in the San Juan Basin, the Mancos, one in the oil, one in the natural gas. So if you want to look back at the San Juan, just see some of those numbers that ICAV and Logos and DJR Enduring are producing in the Mancos gas. So those guys are pretty well healed, but you got to talk about small independents. Where do you see the future for small independents in today's environment? We take on riskier, and I say riskier now, it's almost like a regulatory risk. I'll add that into the risky.
So I think there's a few different areas. First of all, I think it's a critically important area. I suspect this country would have almost no shale oil production versus being now the world's largest crude oil producer by a large margin if it wasn't for independent producers. Like, that's not a close call. And you know this is true because just look at other countries. It is hardly, we are not the only country with developable shale, yet we are the only country to develop our shale. And a big portion of that is rule of law, it's capitalism, but it's also competition and the thousands of independents that basically crack the code on how to figure out shale. Right. And that is why I've always been skeptical that PetroChina, in consultation with some super major, was going to figure out shale in China. They don't have the incentives, and two super large companies doing it is not the way you're going to get the most out of your domestic resource. So it's a critical industry. What I worry most about the private industry is related to access to financing, and it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast we're having. But people focus on ESG. I get it, but it's the wrong focus area, in my opinion. It is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It's an umbrella organization run by Mark Carney, who tries to get big banks like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, et cetera, to agree to an emissions financed objective, which means you'll only make loans if you can show that over time, by 2030, 2040, and 2050, the emissions that are tied to the companies who you've given the loans to, that the emissions are going to zero. What does that actually mean? It means you're not going to provide financing over the long run to the oil and gas industry. But which oil and gas industry? Russian oils, you may ask? We shouldn't provide them. No. How many loans is Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan making to Lukoil? None. Is it the National Iranian Oil Company that Mark Carney and Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero are after? No. There's no way Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan are making loans to the Iranian oil. It is American companies, it's Canadian companies, it's Western European companies. These are the ones who de facto suffer under this type of capital constrained environment. And it deserves pushback. It deserves congressional pushback. It deserves people to understand this issue. It's easy to pick on ESG and some of the big investors out there. Again, you can have views. I'm not here to defend or attack that. It is a sideshow compared to the real damage that can be done by this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which again is an umbrella organization over trying to cobble together big banks and big insurance companies to no longer provide financing or insurance to the oil and gas industry. And the big companies can survive this. It may not be pleasant, but big companies can survive it. The ones that will suffer the most, in my opinion, are the smaller players. Now you can say, well, hey, I've got a regional bank that I do business with. How have regional banks been doing over the last couple of years that we've cracked up interest rates? Some are doing okay. Hopefully the ones in Texas and your part of the world are doing okay. But it is no cup of tea to be dependent on regional banks that are part of this broader financial system that is putting all this pressure, again, only in the US, Canada, and Western Europe. That's the problem. It's not being applied to hostile nations. It's being applied to friendly countries and friendly companies in these friendly countries. That who suffers from this. And that is what I would worry most about with private companies. I would otherwise say it's a great time to be a private oil and gas company because you're not faced with the kind of shareholder pressures the big companies are faced. So I like the fact that small companies are willing to take risk. I think that is a real appeal. And at a time when oil and gas prices are otherwise still low, they are absolutely still low, I think you have a chance to do very well. But you got to ensure you have access to financing and insurance. And that is something I worry about for everybody, but especially for the smaller companies.
Well, we've seen some of the BLM proposals on bonding on leases, just gone from per lease is like just astronomical numbers. I was in the $5 or $10 million bond per lease. So if you have a unit, that could be a bond of $100 million for a unit if you have 20 leases in a unit or something. So I mean, it's just and that's what they're proposing. I guess they want to put the little guys out of business, but
I mean, that's what's so perplexing. Like, again, big companies can survive all this stuff to a much greater degree. I mean, almost all politicians, this is especially true of people left of center, will say they don't like big oil. Yet all these actions do nothing but, ensure that you have to be bigger and all this kind of stuff. And you see it in some of the recent merger activity. It's not that the super majors we have in the US today, which are down to Exxon and Chevron, they're clearly large companies, but even otherwise still very large companies, Hess and Pioneer have decided that it makes more sense for them and their shareholders to be part of these super majors rather than turn over management to a future generation. It's a remarkable set of developments. I do hope this will change. I do think there are cycles where you have capital formation and new companies, smaller companies that is, are created, but we've not seen that kick up yet. And again, I worry that the insurance side, which is very European driven, the reinsurance market in particular, it's very European driven. Whatever we think about American politics and divisiveness and all this stuff, it is 10 times worse in Europe because they all want to, they're all climate ideologues over there. And therefore the pressure on their insurance companies to no longer provide financing. And of course, what do they say they don't want to do? They don't want to do oil sands in Arctic. That somehow only translates to Canada and Alaska. Norway is doing $19 billion of projects, and somehow Norway doesn't count as quote Arctic. So I'd say good job by the Norwegian government to not brand themselves as Arctic. But all these pressures, they end up falling just on our companies. And that is something I cannot understand. I do not understand why, even if you were the most diehard environmentalists who absolutely hated the oil and gas industry, why you would start with our own companies. It makes absolutely no sense.
The cost and the cost of energy, the decline in electrical use across Europe, especially, and starting here in the United States, it's incredible. I mean, we talk about the energy transition. I would just maybe call it, well, we can end here, just call it an overall world transition. We're in a world transition right now, and we're not in the Cold War world of the 60s, 70s, and it's the transition we are in is really, really significant right now. It's
a very tumultuous time, and in part because there is a lot of energy ignorance out there. There is the idea that if you just yell at a bunch of big oil companies to, quote, keep it in the ground, that somehow improves the world, when of course it makes it significantly worse. We have, a war in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. We have the seeds of a pretty meaningful Middle East conflict being sown, and we'll see where it progresses. We should all hope for world peace, but you obviously can't, hope is not a strategy. And we're at a time where there's underinvestment in energy across the board. There is recognition increasingly that the new stuff that people were counting on is significantly harder, significantly more capital intensive. It does not work in a 5% interest rate world, let alone if interest rates go higher. It required that former 0% interest rate world. It has required a whole bunch of government subsidies that our government increasingly cannot afford, and certainly the European government can't afford either. And there's, again, 7 billion people in the rest of the world who increasingly say, why do I want to depend on what the Europe does or says, or what the US says or does? We're going to go our own way. And I think there's actually some good news in them going their own way. I think if you're India, and if you were, my parents are from India, I'm American, I was born here. But I think if you're from India, you might say, well, I'm glad I don't have to depend on Europe or the US or these former colonizers anymore. We're going to go our own direction. I think China is obviously going in their own direction. So there is something, encouraging about that. They're not going to succumb to the kind of they may have different ideological mistakes, but it won't be this idea that we should somehow not use all forms of energy. That's not going to be one of the mistakes they make. And so I take some hope in that. I think the final point that I didn't answer before that you asked about is, I do think there's a dearth of vocal leadership that comes out of the oil and gas industry. And I think part of it is, I live in the New York area. There obviously is only one oil company in New York, and they just got bought, Hess. So I'm very sorry that my local oil company has now been purchased by a California oil company, for goodness sakes, right? By the way, I like to Chevron people. But anyway, everyone's in Texas, Oklahoma, maybe New Mexico. It does create a little bit of a bubble where there isn't the outreach, there isn't politicians, there aren't other folks outside of the industry that understands the oil and gas industry. One of my favorite things I've done the last year is I went to the Permian Basin Museum in Midland, Texas. We need a Permian Basin Museum, in New Jersey or New York, that people can understand the history of energy. And so there is a need for energy leaders to speak up. I applaud Chris Wright of Liberty Frac Services for speaking up. I think he does it in a different way, but I like the way that Toby Rice makes the case for U.S. LNG exports. He does it in his own special way. I will give Mike Wirth credit for trying his best to be a voice amongst the bigger companies that goes on some of the business shows and the talk shows. So he is trying in his own big oil company type. I'm a huge fan of his, but it comes across differently when it's a really large oil company and so forth. And so I would like to see more independence. Just give basic energy education. It does not have to be the left stinks, the right's great, or vice versa. There are lots of issues with the right. It is about educating people on energy and why we use it. We need more of that. So I applaud you, Jerry, for doing a podcast and a YouTube. You're doing your work. We need far more people speaking out on energy.
Well, we have people and colleagues who go, why can't, we're being outspent 4-1 from the NGO enviros to the energy companies, and they're killing us. But we have more surgical messages like you and maybe me, Chris Wright, and some of these others, and at the end of the day, if the sun doesn't shine and the wind's not blowing and your generator doesn't, you don't have a solar generator, I mean, your lifestyle is going to go down, and people are not going to like that. People are not going to. People
you can already see that in Europe.
People are not going to want that.
You can already see the lifestyles
transition.
going down. Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge. You can see it in Europe. I'm sorry to interrupt there. You can see it in Europe. The lifestyles are starting to. The thing is, these are slow bleeds too. So suddenly you wake up 30 years from now and your country's gone from first world to first and a half to second world. Europe is headed in that direction. I have a lot of hope America will not go in that direction. It starts with basic energy education and understanding, and I think we need a lot more of that. So,
well, we could go on, and I think this was a good intro to hear your message. Super spiked. We'll put it out there in the e-blast on how they can get in touch with you and see what you put out. And I like the fact that it comes on a Saturday morning, because you're kind of like getting up and going, and okay, here's Arjun on for and I like what you said, 15 to 20 minutes. It's not a long-winded deal. It's very concise, and the fact that you narrate yourself, which is quite amazing. So
thank you very much, Jay. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me on. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Yes, thanks. And we'll get you down to the San Juan Basin. You can see and by the way, the coal bed methane, they're drilling horizontal wells on those, and those are quite some really good wells up in the northern part of the basin where it's dry. So, but
I actually lived in Albuquerque for a year after my freshman year of college. A little bit of a long story, probably for a different podcast, but I got a little bit of New Mexico in me, so I'm always welcoming coming back to the States. So.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, I'm based in Denver, but
I went to college. I went to University of Denver.
In the San Juan Basin. Yeah, so.
That's great.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll see everyone next time on this Energy IQ, San Juan IQ podcast. And thank you again, Arjun. Great to have you, and super spiked. Everyone check it out, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry.
For over 50 years, Process Equipment and Service Company, or PESCO, has been proudly designing, building, and maintaining production equipment for its customers. Located in Farmington, New Mexico, PESCO sells and services units from across the western United States, from large majors to small independents like San Juan Resources. PESCO is proud to sponsor the Energy IQ, and they look forward to working with you, supporting the San Juan Basin community in any way they can. Whiptail Midstream operates crude oil, natural gas, and water gathering systems in the San Juan Basin to handle growing production from the Magna Shale. With more than 500 miles of well-positioned infrastructure, Whiptail is capable of delivering 38,000 barrels of oil per day, 100 million cubic feet of natural gas per day, while gathering and safely disposing of 8,000 barrels per day of produced water. Whiptail is an energetic and innovative company, is happy to support improving our Energy IQ.